And again, we are really fortunate to have Peter speak to us on this very important topic. Now, while this is Sri Lanka's 17th IMF agreement, this is the first time we are having an IMF agreement after Sri Lanka defaulted, and we are in the process of debt restructuring. So that brings a lot of complexity. We've analyzed, observed IMF programs in the past, but I think for many of us, these are new times. And not only that, Sri Lanka is also going through the worst economic crisis since independence. So in this kind of a context, how do we understand the IMF program, the targets and the conditionalities of the IMF? There are many questions. We have communicated some of these questions to Peter. The format of the session today would be for us to have Peter speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will have anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour for Q&A with Peter. And so I would ask that you hold your questions until after Peter finishes his presentation, and then we might even collect a few questions together to make the discussion more productive. Thank you again to all of you for participating, and to Peter. Peter, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you for the welcome. I'm looking forward to it. I want to make very clear from the outset that, you know, I'm not here just to speak, and I'm certainly not here to preach. I'm here as much as anything else to learn. So I'm hoping it will be an active discussion. I hope there will be some points of pushback and so on. And the other thing to say, obviously I'm just going to speak initially about 30 minutes or so. That doesn't give me a chance to cover everything. But I want to introduce a few ideas that maybe will challenge some of the way that some of you think, and hopefully challenge more that what some other people think about what's going on in Sri Lanka with its IMF program. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to now start to broadcast my screen to show you my slides. Hopefully this works. All right, so can you see my title slide? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so as was introduced, you know, a sort of big question overarching the whole set of developments in Sri Lanka is that one, good, bad, or ugly, or all of the above. I'm going to argue that it's largely the latter two in the case of the prescriptions that the IMF is bringing to Sri Lanka. I'm very critical of what it is, how it has set up the program. But in order to sort of make that case, I want to first of all say a few words about the global setting in which the crisis for Sri Lanka takes place. Now, I don't mean just the fact that we're post-Ukraine crisis and COVID, and now obviously this problem in Gaza. That's one way of thinking about the setting. I more want to make some points about the intellectual setting in which the crisis that's going on in Sri Lanka and the program in Sri Lanka is taking place. So you will all have read in the newspapers and seen report everywhere that there was talk of a global credit crisis or a debt crisis. There's all these countries, 40 or 50 of them, says the IMF, in some form of debt distress or on the verge thereof. So the word that is in people's mind is debt distress. I want to argue that this actually quite badly misstates the nature of the ongoing problem. What do I mean? The global problem. Well, there are some people who will say, well, okay, the reason we talk about the debt distress is we think that it's the same thing as a growth problem. Countries are indebted, they can't pay their debts, therefore they have to do restructuring, and that means they can't grow. So there's an idea that these two issues, a growth crisis and a debt crisis, are synonymous. But very clearly they are not. It's perfectly possible for a country to, so to speak, run itself into the ground in order to pay its debt. In that context, the debt is paid. There is no default on the debt comes down. You have what in this context would be a growth problem, a growth crisis, rather than a debt crisis. So who is it that talks about a debt crisis? And the answer is it's the creditors. The creditors globally worry a great deal about getting their money back. So if they think there is some possibility of debt non-payment, they will talk about a debt crisis. And obviously the IMF is a principal creditor. So it talks about a debt crisis. However, in work that I have done, and which I can elaborate later on in Q&A if you're interested, I've shown that there's a much bigger group of countries, rather than the 40 or 50 now spoken of as being in a debt crisis. There's over 100 countries, developing countries, in the world, which over the past 30 years have been growing below potential because they are serving excessive debt. So the problem is not just recent, it's not just after COVID and not just after the Ukraine crisis, that's giving rise to debt issues. I'm saying the much longer program globally is a growth problem, which has been going on for 30 years, and this was before even Ukraine and COVID came along. So debt crisis and growth crisis are not the same things. That said, there is, when you do have a debt crisis of some form or another, a pivotal role for the IMF in its resolution, part of which you can see going on in Sri Lanka right now. The point I want to make here is, rather than go through all of the details about how that works, is again a conceptual issue. When I say that the role of the IMF in debt restructuring of countries is pivotal and comprehensive, I want to make absolutely clear that what I'm talking about is not the IMF managing director. I'm not talking about the IMF staff. I'm talking about the IMF executive board. So the board that actually runs that institution, that board, as you know, is represented on that board are all the countries of the world, but it's a weighted voting system. So it's entirely dominated by the rich countries of the world. So when I say what's the role of the IMF executive board, I'm saying the collective of rich country governments represented on the IMF board. And their role in debt restructuring, when you conceive of the IMF that way, is absolutely comprehensive. They run the whole show. Why is that? Not only because they control the actual technical institution of the IMF, they also control their own bilateral lending. So the lenders, all these major governments, these rich governments, do all the bilateral lending involved. They also control all of the lending that's done by the multilateral development institutions, all these development banks and so forth. But it doesn't end there. They also control the legal frameworks under which private credit is extended and restructured to the developing world. So they literally run the entire show. That's a point that quite often gets lost because a lot of them spend a lot of time pointing their fingers. Oh, it's not me, the representative of the German government, it's those bad people over there in China, or it's those bad bondholders over there. There's a lot of finger pointing elsewhere. But the collective is responsible for how debt evolves and how it is restructured globally. The collective is represented on the IMF executive board. And therefore, there should, in all of our own analysis of it, be collective responsibility. We should be holding the collective responsible and ignoring their endless finger pointing, which obfuscates their pivotal role overall. So if you want to know who is driving the design of the restructuring program in Sri Lanka, and indeed elsewhere, in Ghana, Zambia, the other places, Suriname, the other places being restructured now, Somalia, etc. It's the IMF Executive Board, and that means the rich country governments of the world are the people who are to be held responsible for what is going on. One of the ways that some people talk about evidence that this restructuring is not working, as a general statement, again, it's still in the intellectual setting for all of this. One of the ways that some people say is, look, there's a large number of a set of countries which seem to come back to the IMF again and again and again and again. And, one of those is Sri Lanka. So one of the arguments you will hear, and I think it does have quite a lot of merit, is, well, if countries are coming back again and again, that tells you that there's something fundamentally inadequate with the restructuring of debt and of arrangements in those countries. The whole idea of the restructuring is supposed to clear the decks, sort out the problem, and the country proceeds by itself. And in a large number of cases, that's not happening. So, says one line of reasoning, and I think it has a lot of merit, that is a symptom of the fact that the restructuring arrangements that are in place are not doing an adequate job because they're not clearing the decks. Countries come back again and again. But in order to sort of really develop that case and now shift from this global intellectual setting now into Sri Lanka itself, I want to just point out that indeed Sri Lanka has been a repeat customer for the IMF. On this chart, you can see the disbursements every year going back 40 years or so from the IMF to Sri Lanka. And there have been sort of 4 batches of them in 40 years. So this is definitely a repeat customer. And you can see your most recent program showing up there on the right-hand side of the chart. But interestingly, I think Sri Lanka is a case where which does not support the generally correct argument that repeat clients show that something is going wrong. Because over this period that Sri Lanka has been borrowing with the IMF, from the IMF in repeat bouts, Sri Lanka has boomed. Real GDP per capita in 2018 in Sri Lanka was 5 times higher than it was in 1990. So I would say this is a fairly rare case. Sri Lanka is a rare case where a repeat customer to the IMF has actually been an astonishing success story. I can assure you that there are well over 100 countries, developing countries around the world, who would love to be able to say our GDP per capita in 2018 was 5 times what it was in 1990. You are a world leader. So in that case, in this particular case of Sri Lanka, how do I think about your repeated engagements with the IMF? What's going on here? And the way that I would frame it broadly, and this is only true up until the present program. I'm going to argue the present program is a completely different animal. But up until this point, one of the few things, everybody knows about Sri Lanka is that it's had, in its not too distant past, a very long and very, very bitter civil war. And again, to summarize what that means in one way, you could say that is symptomatic of a country composed of people who do not get along particularly well with each other. So what do some countries do which have that particular problem to deal with, given that that problem tends to spill over into poor conduct of its macroeconomic policies? Macroeconomic policies are essentially about distribution of income. If your country is not getting on well with itself, that means that tends to fall apart. So what a number of countries do which have this problem, I think Sri Lanka may be thought of in this way, is outsource the control of its macroeconomic policy instruments to the IMF. And in this particular context, that has worked it's worked, one would say, spectacularly well, because in the context of that happening up until the most recent program, Sri Lanka has boomed. I'm going to come back to that in a bit more detail now as I talk about, given that background of a booming economy with repeated interactions with the IMF successful, how should one think about the framing for the present program in Sri Lanka? What is going on? To make the case, and to sort of explore that a little bit, I'm going to explore three basic theories about the nature of the crisis that Sri Lanka now has. One question is, are the roots of this crisis in Sri Lanka deep or are they shallow? Deep meaning, is this something that has been brewing for years and years and years now, blowing up? Or is it something that emerged very suddenly from a very recent and one-off set of, if you like, policy errors? So the question is it deep or is it shallow? In order to just give some life to this debate, this particular issue, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let Sharmini Kuri give her view. To those of you who don't know who she is, she's a former very senior IMF staff member, became an advisor to the government of Sri Lanka, and I understand is still there. And these clips I'm going to show you from her is her speaking about a year ago to a global conference of top international economists describing what is going on and how Sri Lanka got into its difficulties and what it's doing about it. As you listen to this first clip about the, informing, are the roots of this crisis deep or are they shallow? Take a note of the right-hand side of the screen, which shows you the general government budget balance in Sri Lanka in 2019. And look at that number and listen to what she says against that number.
Sri Lanka's story is somewhat different. The genesis is really a lack of fiscal discipline that had gone on for decades, literally. Sri Lanka had very large current fiscal and current account deficits. Our deficit reached 13% of GDP just before in 2019. So, and this was based on a government that really played a very large role in the economy. We have over 400 public sector enterprises, state-owned enterprises. There are price controls, that subsidized essentially many middle-class people and above were subsidized. So there is a really an issue of correcting some deep fiscal and structural problems in the economy. We went from a low-income economy in 1994 with a per capita income of $464 or so to now 4,000. So Sri Lanka grew very rapidly. Unfortunately, we did not fix our institutional and fiscal problems along the way.
So what Sharmini is advocating here, or saying, is that there's a very deep-seated set of issues in Sri Lanka which has blown up. But did you notice that she said that the GDP, that the deficit, the fiscal deficit of 2019 was 13% of GDP, whereas the number is actually 7.5%. So one of the immediate sort of things to think about what she's saying is that there's a sort of substantial disjoint over the actual numbers. She is simply, I don't know where she gets her 13% of GDP in 2019 from. The number's actually 7.5%. I'm not saying that's good, but it's certainly not, it's a gross exaggeration to talk of a number in, like 13. She also says that there's been this long, and prior to that, long period of weak fiscal policy generating this. Well, let's now look at that proposition. What the chart here shows you is Sri Lanka's primary fiscal balance. What's a primary? A primary fiscal balance is government revenue minus government expenditure excluding interest. And so the red line shows you what that balance has been over the past 30 years, the period that Sharmini is talking about. The grey band there tells you what global best practice is on the primary fiscal balance 4 countries in Sri Lanka's GDP per capita neighborhood. And the best practice is that that's what countries which grew the fastest over this 30-year period, that's what they did. They did a range of primary balance to about primary deficit of 2. They were somewhere there. And what you can see is over this entire period, 30 years, with its interactions with the IMF as a repeat customer, Sri Lanka has been keeping its primary fiscal balance very much within global best practice. So far from it being a fiscal basket case, chaos, it is in fact been following global best practice very well. And that's, in my view, one of the reasons why, indeed a key reason why, Sri Lanka had such an enormous growth in real GDP per capita. So I think, the evidence simply again stacks against a view that says there is a long-run, deep-seated set of issues in Sri Lanka which have blown up. To the contrary, prior to 2020, and we can see in 2020 the story changes, Sri Lanka has been performing outstandingly well in this macroeconomic, by this macroeconomic measure. So the first implication of this is, if you look to the numbers for 2020, is that 2020 is uniquely bad and totally out of order with all the prior 30-odd year and more history of Sri Lanka's strong economic performance. 2020 is bad in a number of ways. Obviously, there's the COVID crisis hitting globally there, but that's one of Sri Lanka's problems, but not its only one. It did undertook a bunch of one-off measures, cutting the rate of VAT and various other things, which were clearly destabilizing and way out of the norm for Sri Lanka. But that tells you that it's not a deep crisis. This is something that emerged that went wrong spectacularly in 2020, rather than something more deep-seated than that. A second kind of question about how the nature of the problem is, was it preceded by sort of a long-run collapse of revenues or by a decline? Is there a special problem in Sri Lanka on the revenue side showing up? And once again, it's useful to listen to Sharmini's quick take on this by contrast. As you listen to her, take account of what's on the right-hand side of the screen, which shows you the ratio of revenue to GDP in 2019. Just take note of that number as you listen to Sharmini talk about the revenue issue.
The other big feature was that our tax revenues fell from, about 20% in the early 90s to a mere 7.5% right now, just before the crisis.
7.5% just before the crisis. No, it was nearly 13% just before the crisis. Again, the basic narrative of there being a sort of a long-run collapse going on is simply not supported by the data. But there clearly has been a decline in the revenue ratios, you can see from the right-hand side. She's right that, around about 2000 was 19% of GDP, but by 2019 it had fallen to 12%. Now, what's noticeable about that decline there ahead of the crisis in Sri Lanka is that as that revenue ratio was dropping, Sri Lanka carried on growing. This was not in the teens, a period where you could see this problem brewing. And as you can see, that as the revenue ratio is declining, the primary balance nonetheless stayed within the best practice band, which meant that Sri Lanka was maintaining macroeconomic balance. It was cutting spending relative to what it might otherwise have been. And it was shifting, if you like, from a growth trajectory led by the provision of public goods through government to a growth trajectory led by the private sector, a shrinkage of the government, but not one that prior to 2020 was macroeconomically destabilizing. So yes, a change in the form of development that was being pursued over the between 2010 and 2019, but not one that was macroeconomically stabilizing, not one that was undermining the growth of GDP per capita. They've had other downsides, but it wasn't until 2020 a major destabilizing issue. And then the last point in terms of framing what's going on in Sri Lanka to mention is you have to ask, okay, there clearly is a major problem that arose in 2020. That's when this thing really went wrong in Sri Lanka. So who is to blame for that? Is that something that went wrong on the borrower side, or is that something that went wrong on the lender side? Once again, it's useful to just listen to Sharmini's account of this, and bear in mind as you listen to her what's on the right-hand side of the screen, the simple circled word saying ditto.
And the way the governments reacted to the decline in tax revenue, which was due to tax cuts, and the decline in exports, is they borrowed abroad, and initially for infrastructure. Quite a chunk of it was not very productive. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about our ports, and but not all of it, I would say. But ports that have and airports that have not been very productive. But a lot of this was financed by bilateral loans, which are not particularly, I mean, they weren't as high as the international sovereign bond rates, but they were not as concessional as multilateral rates. And mainly from China, and also a second aspect of this is we went to the international bond markets and borrowed essentially very large amounts to pay our domestic, to pay the interest bill.
So the way Sharmini is telling the story is it's all borrowers. The borrowers, namely the government of Sri Lanka, lost control, lost its head, went borrowing from the Chinese, went borrowing from the bond markets, all, she says, to pay interest. The problem with that narrative, and it's a narrative, as I say, she's expressing not only for herself, but it's very much an IMF-style narrative, is a simple observation, which is, if there is any bad lending that is done, that is not simply a problem of the borrower, because every cent that is borrowed badly is lent badly. You can only have a bad loan if some lender is willing to lend to you, to misbehave, to squander. So the framing as saying there's simply a problem with the borrower misses the point that you cannot have a bad loan without a bad lender. It's just not possible. So in terms of framing how Sri Lanka got into these difficulties, I would argue that it's clear that the present crisis roots are very shallow. Things went wrong in 2020. Up until then, in macroeconomic terms, Sri Lanka was an astonishing success case, including with its repeated interactions with the fund. That there has been a drop in the revenue ratio during the 2010s, but until 2020, which was when things went badly wrong, it wasn't a collapse, it wasn't a loss of control, it was a fairly orderly decline, which was not macroeconomically destabilizing. And when things went wrong in 2020, the lenders are at least as responsible as the borrowers, and I would say arguably even more so, because when one thinks of who these lenders actually are, we are talking about the most highly educated. They've all got PhDs in economics. They all go in these high-rise skyscraper buildings in the City of London and in Wall Street and so on. They've got every resource available to them. There's no reason why they should not be able to see a government in Sri Lanka in 2020 which is losing control. So the question then becomes, why do they carry on lending, fueling something that is going wrong in 2020? What is going wrong on the lender side of this, that they continue to fund activities which are macroeconomically destabilizing? Okay, finally, I'm going to just make relatively few points about, quote unquote, the cure, the IMF program that is now in place to address all of this, having said that the primary IMF narrative is one that I simply don't subscribe to, don't see supported in the data. Therefore, not surprisingly, I'm not persuaded at all, I should say, by the cure that they are proposing. So what is the main element of the cure in the IMF program? It is that the IMF has declared that Sri Lanka should, as a medium-term target, target a primary surplus of 2.3% of GDP in its budget. And all the adjustments, the cutting of expending and the raising of tax and so on that is going on in Sri Lanka right now, the austerity you might call, is driven by this target. That target also is anchoring the quantity of debt write-offs which creditors are being asked to make. So how do we evaluate that number, the 2.3% of GDP target? Is that a good number or is that a bad number? What do we think of that? In order again to inform that, look again at this chart, which I showed you before. So already in 2024, your government primary balance is above the best target band. And you can see this chart only goes up to 1% of GDP. So the target of 2.3 is considerably above the best practice internationally for countries at your level of GDP per capita. Now, there are two problems with this, which I just want to really highlight here. One is that when a country like Sri Lanka is going into a kind of deep restructuring with the IMF is now, there's a problem just in general, because what's happening is that Sri Lanka's own sovereignty is being compromised. So that's problem number one. You're being told what to do by people who are not Sri Lankans. The IMF Executive Board is telling you what to do. That's problem number one. And then when we look at this anchor number, this medium-term primary balance target, we see that it does not follow best practice. The IMF is imposing something that it knows is not best practice. And again, I want to make sure this is absolutely intuitively clear how bad this is, how nonsensical this is. So I'm just going to give you a quick allusion to another context. So, I'm an old white guy. If I show up at your house and start bossing you about how you're supposed to cook meals in your house, that's a problem right there. I've got no right to show up in your house and tell you how to cook in it. So that's the sovereignty point. But then if I turn around and say to you, not only that, but from now on you have to cook your meals in this house with one hand tied behind your back, you would say, well, this is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, this is plainly not best practice. Best practice is to cook with both hands. This intuitively is what the IMF is doing by imposing a medium-term primary balance target, which is outside of best practice. It's just like telling you to cook with one arm behind your back. So why is the IMF imposing upon you a medium-term primary fiscal balance target, which is not inside or not reflective of best practice? And the answer is because by doing so, those additional resources that are saved away by this high primary surplus target service debt. So this is in the interest of the creditors, but it's at your expense as a borrower in terms of your potential to secure your potential growth. So this is the IMF explicitly now treating Sri Lanka in the interest of creditors as opposed to in the interest of macroeconomic best practice. These two things are not the same, as you can see in the case of Sri Lanka. And just very briefly, this red circle is Sri Lanka. This now shows that, there's your 2.3% of GDP target on the vertical axis. But this is now showing you in the context of all countries in the world right now. The black spotted countries are the countries which have got programs with the IMF right now. The little band that you can see there, the slightly upward sloping three lines, that's the best peer target band that I showed you before. We can see that the IMF is doing this, opposing a primary balance target which is above best practice, not only in Sri Lanka, but in a bunch of other countries in the world. The red dots are non-program countries. Now, Sri Lanka is bad enough at its 2.3, but you can see that there are a bunch of other countries where this is much worse. So South Sudan, Mozambique, Malawi, Argentina, Egypt, and there are various others where the medium-term target is just way outside international best practice for this absolutely crucial variable. And the number for Sri Lanka, also, as you can see, is circled there, is far above. But you're not alone in this problem. This is not a single problem for Sri Lanka. It's a general problem in the way that the IMF is conducting business in the world in the interest of creditors at the expense of growth in the developing world. So there is need to challenge what the IMF is doing, not just in Sri Lanka alone, but is need to challenge what the IMF, its behavior and its conduct globally. In terms of how the IMF came to set that number of 2.3 for Sri Lanka, again, I'm going to skip through a lot of things, but the essential argument, essential point to make is it's completely arbitrary. The IMF, the executive board, decided that the number for Sri Lanka was 2.3, decides other numbers for other countries. It is virtually has a free hand in deciding what it's going to do. But when it sets a number like 2.3 for Sri Lanka, it's saying, well, we can push this country really hard, drive it into the ground in order to pay the debts for the creditors. Now, that's bad enough by itself, that it should do that to Sri Lanka and indeed to others. But if you listen to Sharmini going on, I'm not going to show you this because I can only take so much of listening to her. She, in discussing the Sri Lankan program, acknowledges that even with this exceptionally high primary balance target for Sri Lanka, that the debt to GDP ratio of Sri Lanka is barely going to get down to 95%. So it will still not be enough to secure that Sri Lanka gets to a sustainable debt position. So not only is growth being hampered, but also we're not going to get to a sustainable debt position, which means Sri Lanka may well now turn into one of these bad case repeat countries having to go to the fund, because the amount of debt write-offs being engineered by the fund under its program is evidently too little. There is far too much bailing out of creditors who in 2020 knew that they were lending into trouble and carried on doing it. And it's at the expense of Sri Lanka. And the process, therefore, looking forward, is one that I'm afraid is setting you up, as I say, to have to go back to the fund. There is talk now about the deal with private creditors maybe finally being resolved soon, within a couple of months. On the basis of what I'm arguing, that merely sets you up to have to do the whole process again and again and again in coming years, turning Sri Lanka from a case which over the past 30 years has had a very profitable, very productive repeat relationship with the fund, where you've grown dramatically, into a case where the outlook several years ahead, many years ahead potentially, is one where that becomes acrimonious and unproductive. So that's my introduction. There are a lot more details around all of this thing about how the systems work and so on, but I hope that's given you something to chew on, and I look forward very much to the discussion.
Thank you, Peter. Very interesting sort of presentation of how we read this IMF agreement, because I think the reason why we were also very keen to listen to you is to understand it on their terms, right? So for us in Sri Lanka, there are many kinds of questions. You know, what's going to happen in terms of inequality? What's going to happen in terms of social welfare services, social protection? There are a whole range of questions, but the whole point of going to the IMF is to ensure we are back on the growth path, right? But what they're doing is exactly the opposite, and in fact, even destroy the kind of structure of the economy that we had, however unequal and so on, that we are going to become this repeated crisis case, right? So, I think that's what I draw from your presentation, and what you mentioned in terms of, okay, was Sri Lanka in a deep crisis or was it in a shallow crisis? Now, all our think tanks in Colombo, the advisors to the president, from the time before we even defaulted, including Shamini Kure, they've been pushing a certain ideological understanding of the Sri Lankan economic problem, that it's about having, that we are spending way too much, right? And if you even in terms of government expenditure, what you say about the primary budget deficits, it's well within the range of our best performing peers. Of course, falling revenues is a problem in terms of there's been a decline in terms of what we are spending on education, health, and so on, which was there. But that's not about the macro fundamentals as it leads to crisis, and you've pointed that out. And so the revenues did not collapse, but there has been a secular decline, and the root cause of this is the way in which the lenders are dealing with Sri Lanka, because we would need some amount of development financing, and that wasn't the root cause, but it's now leading to a situation where the so-called debt resolution is going to make it so that we become a country that goes through repeated crises, possibly repeatedly defaults. And if you look at what's happened in the last 2 years, since we started in early 2022, just before we defaulted, when we decided to go to the IMF and started implementing their recommendations, including towards this primary budget surplus, what have we seen in 2022? Our economy contracted by 7.8%. The economy shrunk. I mean, we're talking about growth. No, it shrunk. What happened in 2023? It contracted by 3.6%. And we are seeing this sort of social devastation that affects across the board when they do that, and they're justifying it with this primary budget target that is necessary. That's why interest rates were, jacked up from 6% to 16.5% in 22-23, with effective lending rates of 29%. So all the small businesses collapsed, and that's also part of the contraction story. Now, as I open this up for questions, my question to you is, Sri Lanka is facing an election year this year. We are looking at presidential elections later this year, and parliamentary elections also in the next year. What happens if a new government comes? Because there is mounting social pressure that these austerity measures that come with this primary budget surplus target are just unacceptable. What's the point of getting this kind of stability? First of all, you've shown that this is not going to lead to stability. Even if it did, if people are going to be starving, what's the whole point of it? And this is going to be the response, I think, in the elections. And when a government refuses to accept this primary budget target, what would the IMF do? Would they walk away from Sri Lanka? What, in your experience from looking at countries around the world, what would happen? Shall we take a couple questions and then along with this one, and then you could respond? Okay, Devaka has his hand up. Let me okay. Can you talk? Okay. Yes, Devaka, you can unmute and talk now. Devaka, you have to unmute and you can talk.
Oh yeah, sorry, there was a issue with the Zoom. Now I can hear you. Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Helen was saying, that this is a really helpful presentation for understanding, the possibility, very real possibility that Sri Lanka could, enter into repeated crises because of these targets. But my sort of broader question that I had for you, Peter, as well, is, I know that you're talking about sort of the macroeconomic fundamentals and the fact that, rather than what some people like Shamini, for example, have been saying, Sri Lanka was not engaged in this type of out of control spending or whatever it is. But I'm wondering too if there's still an argument to be made um, that there are longer term roots to this crisis, but not in terms of the fiscal deficit, but in terms of the current account deficit, right? Because I think one of the things that we've also tried to do or tried to think about in terms of the crisis is that, there was expansion of the import bill over the years since liberalization in the late 1970s. Sri Lanka eventually went to these international capital markets, right, and increased its external commercial borrowings. And so all of these are questions revolving around external debt, right? And so I was wondering, even if we are obviously, very critical of this idea that, oh, okay, it's been Sri Lanka's out of control spending that's been the problem. I was wondering if there's still a way of questioning the underlying growth model, because again, it's not to say Sri Lanka shouldn't spend, especially through the government deficit, but in terms of what kind of growth, is it oriented towards the needs of the broader population? Or, for example, how were the sort of external commercial borrowings being put to use? Was it even possible in any real sense for these external commercial borrowings to contribute to the development of the country when they came with such high interest rates and all of that? And the last point I wanted to make was that, again, I think too, we've been talking about this primary surplus target that the IMF is proposing or imposing, but there's also a question of the policy framework, the broader policy framework that comes with this IMF agreement. And, one of the things that we saw during the crisis was that, I believe it was in 2022, I could be wrong, but there basically were import restrictions that were imposed that managed to actually, to a very large extent, sort of compress the import bill. But since then, the IMF has been saying, no, you need to phase out these import restrictions because, again, the IMF's overall emphasis is on, economic liberalization, trade liberalization, and even earlier, obviously, liberalization of the capital account. So I was wondering if there's a way too of questioning that sort of dogma, in which if Sri Lanka is now trying to think about alternative possibilities for spending, what it needs to spend on, whether we can also talk about this in terms of things that have long been outside the range of sort of quote unquote acceptable policy discourse, including import substitution. So again, not to say that that as you're saying that, this whole question of growth, hasn't been raised before, and that in fact Sri Lanka did quite well over the past several decades, broadly speaking, in terms of growth. But given that these other structural constraints existed, especially in terms of the current account deficit, whether we can think of a different kind of growth strategy that would again avert this need to keep going back to the IMF to deal with the crisis. Thank you.
Okay, I thought I saw another hand up. There is one question in chat. I'm going to focus on questions relating to Sri Lanka, or a couple questions. Maybe it's easier if you can ask it out, even though it's written. Shall we start with Yadusha? Would you like to state your question?
Hi.
Thank you, Peter, for the presentation on Sri Lanka and the IMF and the whole program. So I was curious to know, because you were talking about or comparing mainly about where the narrative is on the narrative about the crisis, or at least the mainstream narrative about the crisis focuses on or shifting the blame onto the borrowers, and you were also talking about the lenders as the problem. So I was curious to know, like, what do you think about IMF itself lending money to Sri Lanka? And that does not come without an interest rate. It comes with high interest rates, with surcharges and all of that. So nationally, the narrative was going that IMF is the solution. We should all go to IMF to resolve our economic crisis and so on. And my question is to understand what is IMF's justification to these high interest rates, especially for a country like ours in the global south. And yeah, that's basically the question. Thank you.
And I'll read out Peter Rezel's question because his mic is not working. If the IMF is aware that their stipulations are going to drive Sri Lanka's economy to the ground, isn't that counterproductive from a lender perspective? That's one question. Then there's also a question in chat from Rajashri Dasgupta. Is it not correct that large income tax concessions to the rich and corporate sector since 2019 are the main cause of the fiscal crisis? Maybe there are, I think, one or two other questions. Maybe we'll start with these, Peter, and then maybe the next round we will take some more questions.
Okay, well that's a great menu of questions. So I think I'm going to take them in the order that they were given. So the first question from you, Anhan, was about, okay, so if the program is basically misspecified, it's resulted in a very deep recession initially, and even if we get to some form of recovery after that with these very high primary surplus targets, what is the prospect of an incoming government simply facing too much pressure domestically to be able to deliver that? Then what happens? If I summarize your question properly. And I think my answer to that question is simply to say it's a very clear illustration of what happens when IMF program conditionality is misspecified. If the IMF gets its conditionality specification wrong, that is a very serious problem. And partly because what happens is what you're alluding to. Your intuition is, okay, so we may scramble through to get through this election. We then have some, new government coming in facing these impossible demands. How can it possibly survive when it is trying to satisfy such non-best practice requirements? And that is the basic point that I'm making. You end up in a situation where you end up with repeated problems. I'm not saying, and I'm going to make an allusion to this, I'm not saying that Sri Lanka is just about to turn into Argentina. But by far, the clearest global example in history of a country which, because initially the IMF did not get its program specification right, did not get the write-offs right, Argentina has had to come back again and again and again and again to the IMF over decades. We've had massive exchange rate crisis, gigantic IMF programs, and we've now got this sort of very far right-wing character in Argentina proposing all sorts of things that even the IMF think are crazy. It's so crazy. It's that. If IMF program conditionality is that badly misspecified, that is the sort of unproductive future that it maps out for a country. Argentina is at an extreme of this case. I very much hope, and I don't think Sri Lanka is heading into that kind of extreme, but it's heading into that general territory. Okay. Now you asked a very deep question, which is, okay, in that context, what does the IMF do? Is there, and implicitly you're asking, is there any chance that the IMF might come to its senses? That the IMF might say, okay, we had our first shot at Sri Lanka with its target of 2.3, that has not worked. Is there any chance they would turn around and say, clearly we need to do more, and we need to actually do something that will fix this, as opposed to something that will patch it over for the benefit of, of creditors? Don't hold your breath. All I will say on that is sort of, I personally, by presenting the arguments that I am presenting, not only to people like you, but I've also presented these arguments to people inside the IMF itself, and pressing very hard. And I'm pressing also this argument in amongst other creditors in the World Bank and in other places, to try and build awareness of how technically to identify when the medium-term primary balance target is wrong. Because again, the kind of narrative that you will find from people like Shalmini and other people like her inside the IMF is, we must ignore all this complaining that's coming from, these countries, because all they do is complain. It's bad policy, they're all complaining, and in fact what they need is a big stick to clean house, and then all will be well. That's the narrative. And what the work that I'm doing is showing that no, a target of 2.3 is not ambitious, which is the famous word that the IMF loves to use when talking about its Sri Lanka program. Ambitious target, which sounds like something we should all get behind and be very for, and say, no, it's incoherent is what it is. It is deviant from best practice. And because it's deviant from best practice, you will not get best practice results. You will get worse. You are literally telling Sri Lanka to go into the kitchen and cook with one arm behind its back, is what you are doing. So, but there is a need to get off this narrative which says any form of complaint is just little bad people who don't know how to run policies whinging. And we need to say, no, there is actually a coherent technical analysis. This is not just whinging. This is identifying misspecified conditionality. In order to maximize the chances of Sri Lanka actually getting the IMF to make that intellectual leap, it will help enormously if voices like yours in Sri Lanka can join with other voices in other parts of the world which are being similarly hammered by this misspecification. I've given you the cases which are the most pronounced, which are, I'm going to say them again, South Sudan, Mozambique, Malawi, Egypt, Argentina, Jamaica, Barbados. In all of these cases, the deviation from best practice is much worse than is what's being imposed on you in Sri Lanka, will be much more damaging in their cases. It would be very useful if that kind of collection of countries could join together, voices in them, including independent analysts such as yourself, to say, this makes no sense. If you just go on your own, I think the IMF will say, you're just complaining because you're complaining, tighten your belt, is what they will say. So it's not, if you like, a simple answer to say the IMF will come to its senses afterwards, but I hope I've given you some idea about how to increase the chances of bringing it to its senses afterwards. The second question was another very profound question, which was to do with the external current account, to do with the interaction in the past for Sri Lanka with foreign borrowers and so forth. I want to just point out, before I sort of give my answer to this is another case where you can see Shalmini simply misquoting the numbers. She said in that introduction that I showed you that Sri Lanka not only had these very high fiscal deficits, and I've shown you that's false, she also said that there were very high external current account deficits, which there were not. You look at the data, you get to sometimes to 4% of GDP or something like that. This by no means is, an extreme out of kilter current account deficit. And for most of the past 30 years or so, Sri Lanka has been considerably less than that. So it's simply not the case either that Sri Lanka has been running these wild fiscal deficits for decades, or that it's been running sort of unsustainable, crazy current account deficits. It's simply not true. And if you like, it's obviously the case that it's not true, because if there were such disequilibria going on, there's no way that Sri Lanka could have been growing a GDP per capita such that it's now 5 times higher than it was 30 years ago. It's not possible. So the narrative of sort of these major external imbalances, which is part of the prevailing narrative, is simply rejected by checking the numbers. Just go and check the numbers. It's not true. All right. Having said all of that, there are, and this is what the question is getting to, very penetrating, deep questions to ask about, okay, what is the right way for Sri Lanka going forward to interact with foreign borrowers, given the rate of interest that has to be charged, given the crisis that's underway, given the inadequate debt restructuring on the fiscal side that is going on. What has happened in the past, and to that I would say, just look at your own successful past 30-year economic history. In a context where you've had a great deal of opening to the international capital markets, you, Sri Lanka, have done exceptionally well. In the big picture, this has been a very successful interaction for Sri Lanka up until 2020. And as the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There has been a productive relationship with foreign capital up until 2020. At that point, it changed, it broke down. You're going to find that in the context where IMF program is misspecified, where there's a lot of social pressures arising as a result, then where there's big changes in the exchange rate, so importers and exporters will be screaming, that there will be lots of calls for controls on imports, controls on capital arrangements and so on, right? One thing to just try to avoid, is to say, is to misprescribe the cure. The problem is not, I think, that your relationship with foreign capital in general is wrong. The problem is that the IMF program is misspecified. So don't try and fix the misspecification of the IMF program by now starting to muck about and muddle with your other relations with international capital markets. Go to the source of the problem, which is the fact that the program itself is misspecified. And it's a fairly common story you will find in other countries in the world, where you have a misspecified IMF program, inadequate debt restructuring. It's very common for countries to try and muddle their way through such a problem by putting up import barriers and so on. Not a strategy, I think, that Sri Lanka wants to go with, not least in light of your own dramatically successful prior history. It's worked for you. What you want to do is try and get back to the point where it works for you. And the way to do that is to challenge this misspecified IMF program, is what I would argue. The next question was, and I was pointing out in my general talk, was that a key issue is that lenders play a big role in generating this problem in 2020. And one of those lenders is, of course, the IMF. And that means, one of the issues that should be thought about in the case of Sri Lanka is the conduct of the IMF as lender, not just as lender of last resort, but as lender in general. Because Sri Lanka is not the only country in the world that got into problems in 2020. Another clear case of a country which was prior to, for the prior decade, being booming, doing extremely well, and suddenly getting knocked over in 2020 is Ghana. Okay? And one of the problems that Ghana had was that in 2020, the IMF and all the other official creditors came rushing in and said, you know, we've got the COVID crisis, we must lend to you. They sort of flooded Ghana with money and lending in 2020, which literally totally upset their macroeconomic equilibrium beyond the problems that were derived from COVID itself. So Ghana also then had to default. Ghana's also had to now go into a debt restructuring like Sri Lanka. Ghana's also got a misspecified medium-term target. Its medium-term primary balance, like yours, is also above the thing. So it's, you know, it's another country. So the IMF, the question pointing to the role of the IMF as lender in sometimes actually causing these problems has merit. And I can point to the case of Ghana as a very specific and clear example of this happening very recently. Of course, the IMF will shriek with denials, or no, we won't do all this, but that's the only coherent way to understand what went wrong in Ghana in 2020. But then to finish my attempt to answer this question, the question also then wanted to say, but what about these sort of high interest rates, which, you know, borrowers now from the IMF have to pay? Isn't that a further aspect which should be challenged? To which I say two things. The base rate at which IMF lends to countries is a weighted average of LIBOR rates internationally. And global interest rates, LIBOR rates have gone up. You know, the Federal Reserve has raised its policy rate, so has the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan and others, okay? So that is simply, if you like, a fact of life, that the global interest rates have gone up. And anybody who's borrowing from the fund, including now Sri Lanka, has to pay this now higher rate of interest, matching the rise in global interest. But that's only one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is to do with this issue of IMF surcharges, because the IMF has an absolutely crazy set of policies whereby if programs are deemed large, then, and I'll leave it vague for a minute what that means, the borrowers have to pay not only the weighted average of LIBOR, but these surcharges on top of these global interest rates. And these surcharges can come to impose a very heavy burden on the countries. There is no good justification for the surcharges, none. And there is a fairly lively campaign to which I put my name to get the IMF to abandon this absurd imposition of surcharges. But I would finally say on this matter, if you were to give me a choice between two things globally, do I want subsidized IMF lending rates to developing countries, or do I want the IMF to impose best practice primary medium-term targets? I choose medium-term targets that are best practice. That is much better for developing country borrowers than slightly cheaper money funding, supporting primary surplus targets that are not best practice. I choose best practice medium-term targets over slightly cheaper IMF money in my ordering of preferences, to not only for Sri Lanka, but for countries beyond that. The next question was another, this was very thoughtful questions coming today, which was, if I'm right, hallelujah, if I am right, and that the medium-term target for Sri Lanka is growth impairing for Sri Lanka, isn't that also at the disadvantage of creditors? Surely the intuition is creditors are more likely to be paid if an economy to which they're lending is thriving. That's the intuition. Okay? So given that there is at one level an interest of creditors in a thriving economy, why is the IMF imposing conditions notionally on behalf of creditors, which is growth impairing? Excellent question. And my answer to it is that there are essentially two classes of creditors. There's what I'm going to call old creditors, people who have lent to Sri Lanka in the past, who've already got claims outstanding on Sri Lanka. All they're interested in is getting their money back. And those are the big creditors. They have the voice at the IMF Executive Board. However, there's another class of creditors, theoretically just waiting on the sidelines, who are looking at this misspecified IMF conditionality Sri Lanka, saying, it's misspecified, this country isn't going to grow, I'm certainly not going to come in to lend money to Sri Lanka in this context. So the potential new creditors are driven away from Sri Lanka. But rather than them going to the IMF board and saying, look, you're driving us away, they literally just go away. They go to another country, they go somewhere, they don't speak. So there is a significant imbalance, if you like, a political economy imbalance globally between the old creditors who have the say over the IMF Executive Board and drive these growth impairing targets versus potential new creditors who say, my goodness, if it's got cleaned up, Sri Lanka's a booming place, that's where I want to be. But it's not cleaned up because it's being held hostage to the old creditors. And there needs to be a way of joining the voice of the disadvantaged borrowers like Sri Lanka, like Mozambique, like South Sudan, and so on, to the voice of potential new creditors to say, we need best practice, medium-term primary balance targets from the IMF, not these crazy growth-destroying things which serve the interest of the old creditors. And then there was the last question, which I had noted from this group, which was it the case that it was tax concessions, to the well-off in sort of 2020, which was fundamentally at the root of Sri Lanka's crisis? And all I'll say to that is, basically, yes, there were more. There was cuts in the VAT, there was a surge in military expenditure, there was a bunch of other things that happened in 2020. My concern about these things is not, so to speak, the merits of whether it's good or bad to cut taxes for the wealthy. I'm leaving that aside. I'm just looking at the macroeconomics, because that led to a complete, blowout on the primary fiscal balance in 2020, leading to all of these problems. It was clearly something that should not have happened, macroeconomically speaking. Sri Lanka would be now in a far better position if we could have completely rewritten the 2020 macro and left it as it had been up to that point, in line with best practice globally.
Thank you, Peter. I think Jude Fernando has a question. Jude, would you like to speak? You're muted, and then, or otherwise I'd have to read your question, but I would prefer if you can. Jude?
My mic is not working, Island, properly.
Okay, I'll read out then Jude's. Yeah. We can hear you properly if you want to.
It breaks, so.
Okay, I'll read out Jude's question. He says, if I understand you correctly, Peter, you suggest that growth and financial crises are distinct. You then claim that the economic crisis has deep-seated origins and that in some years, Sri Lankans have performed extraordinarily well in growth. However, is it feasible to believe that the crisis is rooted in or internal to the growth itself, implying that the forces that drove expansion are to blame for the catastrophe? As a result, government failure, civil conflict, and COVID do not fully account for the reasons for the crisis. It may be claimed that these sources are influenced by the growth paradigm. In other words, the financial crisis is caused by growth rather than slowness that impedes it. Hence, a crisis originates from the internal contradictions of capitalism. So why did IMF continue to lend, given that the IMF board governs the global financial system? Lending addresses the global capitalist system's growth crisis. This is why the IMF enforces specific SRL practices. We'll take a couple more questions. This will probably be the last round of questions before Peter responds. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I also have a question. Anybody else? Or there's another question in chat. No, that's just a thank you from Peter. Rizal, who had asked that last question. Any other questions? Okay, so maybe I'll pose my question as well. So, Peter, I mean, if you look at the global economy, not just the global South, but globally, I mean, since the 1980s, we've seen repeated and deepening crises, right? Debt crises, financial crises. Now, at least in terms of the global South, so how do we understand this? Is it one, these repeated crises in some countries are due to the role of the IMF itself and how those crises were supposedly resolved that has pushed them into repeated crisis? Or is it the global or the international financial architecture as it exists with the open flow, with deregulation and the open flow of international capital, the role of capital markets? Is it the international financial architecture itself that is broken and therefore these repeated crises are coming? So while the IMF plays a role, there's a much a bigger problem of the international financial system itself that is the reason for these repeated crises that culminates in a country like Sri Lanka also then collapsing, right? And in the case of Sri Lanka, I mean, I think it's important to note that we survived a 26-year-long civil war, which itself had which itself hugely undermined our growth during that period. But we survived that, and it was supposedly during this post-war boom that we defaulted on our debt. So with greater financialization. So what would be your response to how do we weigh the reasons for these repeated and in fact deepening financial and debt crises?
Okay, but it seems as this webinar goes on, the questions get more and more profound, which means I think we are making progress. So to take the first one, which I'm going to summarize as, okay, the basic macro indicators look pretty good up until 2020, but is it possible that that wasn't therefore just a sudden one-off, but that nevertheless was an eruption of problems that had been brewing long before that in terms of the growth model that Sri Lanka had been following. A very profound question, to which, I mean, I said at the very beginning that I was hoping to learn from this discussion as well as say things. And this will be one place where I think I really could learn from yourselves who are much closer to the ground. But let me just make a few points about it. First of all, pointing in the direction of that argument, the things that I can see. I would say, okay, you could describe the eruption in 2020 as having these long antecedents in Sri Lanka by pointing to the fact that over the prior 30, 40 years, Sri Lanka has repeatedly been a client of the IMF. It's run its affairs in such a way that it needs this external, if you like, factor. It contracts this job out to the IMF, and that need itself reflects a basic structural problem in the governance of Sri Lanka. And you may therefore look at what happened in 2020 as being an example where that external arrangement simply broke down, where the domestic forces broke free of that and it went wrong. So you might say that a country which is dependent on the IMF over an extended period, even if that relationship with the IMF has been successful, is exhibiting a core problem. Now, in making this case in this way, I want to make sure that people here understand that Sri Lanka is not the only country that has done this, not the only entity that has done this, namely contracted out to the IMF major elements of its macroeconomic policy settings. You will be surprised at the example I give you now, because the next example I'm going to give you is the euro area. If you look at the way that the euro area was set up and designed, coming into effect in 1999, there was very little internal disciplining arrangements over the policies of its members. The idea was we have these simple aggregate targets, Maastricht conditions, and so forth, but that within that, countries were pretty much left to their own devices as to what they would do. And what that meant by default was that the task of actually making sure that they stayed on track in line with the euro area sustainability commitments was essentially left to the IMF. And as we all know, that was not a successful contracting out, because we then had the euro crisis in 2008, 9, 10 and onwards. So Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain to a large extent also went belly up, to use a vernacular phrase. And what the euro area did after that was to bring back in-house, to stop contracting this out by building its European Stability Mechanism institution, which is sort of like the IMF now inside the euro area. It's essentially what it is. Okay, they've also greatly strengthened their internal monitoring. So it's not just Sri Lanka that has, for an extended period, contracted out, but as you can see in the case of the euro area, which also did it, they changed their mind and said, maybe this isn't the most effective way of conducting our affairs, and they have reorganized themselves. So maybe one of the challenges for Sri Lanka is, arising from this question, is do you need essentially to now onshore this matter? You've done very well for 40 years contracting it out. Do we need as a structural thing now to bring this back domestically where we run this entirely ourselves? My intuition would be there's a very good case for doing this. I have a great aversion to countries running their affairs in any way dependent on the IMF. That's not a good idea. You should avoid it if at all you can. But I will say that the challenge for Sri Lanka of doing this, of making this kind of institutional and political economy change to bring this task back on shore, will be greatly aggravated, will be made a lot more difficult by the fact that your present program conditionality is misspecified. Why does that make it more difficult? Because it just greatly increases domestic social tensions, political tensions, economic tensions. This is not an environment where a country which has a long-standing history of not getting on with itself particularly well, can now essentially tackle that problem and bring this form of governance fully back home. So yes, I agree with the intuition of the questioner that notwithstanding the good macro numbers that I quoted and only blowing up in 2020, that there may be a more deep-seated way of looking at this and saying, and I'm pointing to this dependence that Sri Lanka has had for 30, 40 years of contracting out this job of setting macroeconomic policy instruments to somebody else, namely to the IMF. So, but beyond that, that is an issue where I'm much more keen to listen to you about that than to talk to you. I would have all my ears open on that very profound question. Then on that last question, which is, going back now to a global setting, from the 1980s, we had a much greater incidence of global financial crises of various kinds. Is there really something wrong with the global financial architecture, which the problem in Sri Lanka is but one symptom of? Not easy to give a short answer to that, but I'm going to just make a few points. My own view is that there has long been, essentially since financial liberalization took place domestically in the United States and in the major countries, an absurdly hands-off attitude to the regulation domestically in the major countries of their financial sectors. Plainly, you cannot explain the dot-com crisis or the global financial crisis without that. An enormous number of the major financial houses in the world were running on paper-thin capital ratios, which meant they had every incentive to take absolutely ridiculous gambles in their credit assessment because they had no skin in the game. And fundamentally, that's how I understand why the global financial crisis happened. My own view is that the regulatory steps taken in the United States and in other financial centers since then remain completely inadequate to fix that problem. The capital ratios, in my view, are still far too low, which means that creditors, this problem of lenders, are far too willing to throw money at issues, even when they can see, as in the case of Sri Lanka in 2020, that policy is not good. Because who knows, maybe it will pay off. Who knows, maybe the IMF will come in afterwards and push up their primary balance targets and we'll get our money back. Okay? You have two sources of incentive for very poor quality lending. One is that the capital ratios are too low in the main financial houses, and the other one is that the IMF comes in and jacks up these primary balance targets after the fact, all encouraging low quality lending. You can address that problem in two ways. As an individual country, you can try and establish capital controls on inflows. Most countries that have tried that find it extremely difficult to make that workable. By far, the most sensible place to try and do it is by fixing it at its root. So you need to greatly increase capital ratios required globally in the main financial centers. And you need to stop the IMF coming in after the fact and raising these medium-term primary balance targets so that creditors who've lent stupidly get their money back. I want to emphasize one other point on this issue of the global financial architecture, which is that as I hear the global debates on this, particularly from the global south, the phrase itself, global financial architecture, is sort of so big and woolly, and it sort of includes all sorts of things to do with voice and representation in the international institutions like the IMF, and reform of the multilateral development banks. It turns into a complete spaghetti bowl of all kinds of agendas and issues and so on, which I think because it is so disparate, has virtually no chance of actually doing anything. Because the various people talking to this matter are talking on so many different subjects that it's easy for, you know, the rich countries in the world simply to ignore it or to do some token this or token that, and on we go, leaving the disorder unaddressed. So, you know, two things to try and hone it down onto well, I'm going to give myself three, actually. Three things which I would try and hone this down onto are: press for proper high capital requirements imposed on financial institutions in the advanced world. Force them to lend with skin in the game, on if they're going to lend at all. Step number two, reform the IMF in the particular of saying it cannot impose medium-term primary balance targets outside the best practice peer band. By doing that, you take away this insurance to low-quality lenders that the IMF is going to come back and chase after them and get them their money back. That puts a lot more pressure on them to lend much more carefully in advance, which would certainly help would have helped prevent this problem happening in Sri Lanka in 2020. And the third point I'll just make very, very briefly, because it's a whole separate project and it's a whole separate agenda. Part of the agenda from the Global South about the reform of the international financial architecture is to do with global warming and to do with the idea that countries in the Global South need more finance in order to curb their emissions. To which my basic response, not least in the case of somewhere like Sri Lanka, do you really think that Sri Lanka needs more finance now to curb its emissions when it is already unable to pay the debt that it has? So the idea in this agenda that what large swathes of the Global South need is more finance to deal with curbing their emissions, when a large number of them are already subject to medium-term primary balance targets above the beer brand, which means that they are already unable to support the debt, is an argument that I simply find absurd. There needs to be a resolution of these countries which are carrying too much debt, and you need to solve the problem of global warming not by curbing emissions in the Global South, but by curbing emissions in the place where the global warming problem actually arose and arises, which is in the Global North. And I have a full set of proposals about how to make that happen, but that's for another day.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for a very engaging discussion. I think you started off the discussion about where does Sri Lanka stand in terms of sovereignty, and also best practices in terms of addressing the macroeconomic situation. And I think, in a way, perhaps both are related in that for too long, Sri Lanka has handed over the responsibility of managing our economy to external actors. And, our first IMF agreement, the 17, now goes back to 1965, but the story goes much longer. Soon after independence in 1948, in 1950, when our finance minister at that time wanted to create a central bank, he went to the Federal Reserve, and John Exter, a Federal Reserve official, came to Sri Lanka and said, you have political sovereignty, now you need monetary sovereignty. And that's how they created the central bank, except that he became the first central bank governor. So a Federal Reserve Bank official who said that we need monetary sovereignty became the first central bank governor of Sri Lanka. So that's been the story of Sri Lanka being controlled from Washington. And And for those who continue to say today that the solution again is to follow the so-called best practices of the IMF, I think you've helped us understand huge holes in the current program, and hopefully we'll wake up and smell the coffee and start thinking otherwise. So thank you again, and thank you everyone who participated and for the questions, and also for our activists with the Yukti Collective who helped organize this webinar and get the word out. This is the first of the webinar series by Yukti. We hope to have more of these webinars to invite people like Peter to come and help us think through what we are facing. So thank you again for taking the time, Peter, and look forward to being in touch. And perhaps one of these days you can be here in person also to speak to us. Thank you,
I
everyone.
look forward to that very much. All right, thank you very much.